What's up, Fox? Fox here, and today we're taking a look at the GeForce GTX 1650. Now, this card has been in my possession for only a few days, and it has automatically become one of my favorite graphics cards of all time, and I think the benchmarks are going to reflect that. But to be honest with you, the reason I love graphics cards that I've never had before, and that's why I feel like this one is close to my heart, because not only is it a card that I've never used before, but it's also a card that I would use. Unlike, say, an RX 550, which I tested a few weeks ago, this is something that is still usable in 2022, still gives pretty good frame rates, which I'll show you in benchmarks very soon, and otherwise just a fantastic little card that I'll be using to put the i5 2400 to the test in a future video of mine. This is a baby Zotac GPU, so let me tell you the specs. The GTX 1650 has 896 CUDA cores, 4GB of GDDR6 VRAM, DisplayPort 1.4, HDMI 2.0, dual-link DVI-D, has NVIDIA Shadow Play, and a recommended power supply of only 350 watts, making it a fantastic candidate for something along the likes of, my guess is an i5, I don't want to say an i5, maybe an i7 4770K. One of those older Intel CPUs are going to do a fantastic job with the GTX 1650. And the 1650 lies in a very odd spot because the GTX 1063 gig is going to perform worse, but it's cheaper. And the 1066 gig is similarly priced on eBay right now, thanks to everything sort of equalizing because of the inflated status, and only has 4 gigs of VRAM compared to the 1066 gig 6. So it's a kind of a toss-up, and I feel like that's why it wasn't widely adopted. And yet I say that, and literally yesterday I watched a random gaming in HD video that said that it's the second most used graphics card of all time. So I guess people have hopped on the 1650 bandwagon, and I can absolutely see why, because it is a fantastic GPU. So let me show you the benchmarks. First things first, we're going to start with the newest game, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. At 1080p low, I probably could have cranked some of the settings up a little bit higher and had a fantastic job, because the average frame rate was 73 with a 1% low of 14 and a 0.1% low of 3. So unfortunately, there was a little bit of stutter, but it definitely wasn't making the game unplayable from what I saw in the benchmark, and you shouldn't have any problems playing Tiny Tina's Wonderlands at 1080p with the GTX 1650. Another recent game, Life is Strange True Colors, which is a little bit of a storytelling game, ran at 80 FPS at 1080p with the medium settings with a 1% low of 17 and a 0.1% low of 4. So a fantastic experience throughout. You could probably pump this up to the cinematic frame rate if you don't care about having 60 FPS, but I enjoyed my 60 FPS gameplay, and that's what we got, which I am very impressed by, considering this card is an entry-level GPU. Another very recent game is Halo Infinite. I was surprised at the results because typically older GPUs don't do fantastic with this game. It's not wonderfully optimized. Nonetheless, Halo Infinite at 1080p with the low settings ran at 59 FPS with a 1% low of 42 and a 0.1% low of 32. So a fantastic showing throughout, and I absolutely loved playing this game with this card. The only issue is if you see some pop-in, it's because all of my games are installed on a 2TB hard drive, and Halo Infinite sucks when it comes to hard drives. God of War next at 1080p with the quote-unquote original frame rate, which is what you would get at PS4, ran at 36 FPS with a 1% low of 30 and a 0.1% low of 24. And I am sure that you will get higher frame rates in other parts of the map, but as you can see, I was fighting a boss, which was a very intensive moment. I'm just glad to see that this GTX 1650 though ran it around what the PS4 would have, because God of War is a fantastic game, and I'm sure if you were to crank things down to low, you could even get 45 FPS or lower the resolution. But honestly, God of War, I think with the original settings, looks good enough, and for some reason 30 FPS doesn't affect me in that game as much as other games do. Far Cry 6 at 1080p with the low settings ran with an average frame rate of 51 with a 1% low of 37 and a 0.1% low of 10. So there was one stutter in this game that caused the 0.1% low frame rate to tank the way it did, but otherwise the game ran perfectly fine and I had no issues whatsoever. You will see it dip down to the 40s or even the 30s in some parts of the map depending on what you're doing, but it was overall a playable experience. Cyberpunk 2077 next. At the low settings at 1080p, we saw an average frame rate of 42 with a 1% low of 10 and a 0.1% low of 4. So not a fantastic experience. There are many parts in Night City where you will see that frame rate tank a little bit, which is unfortunate, and you might want to switch DLSS on. Or I guess in the GTX 1650's case, FSR. Fortnite next at 1080p with the high settings ran with an average frame rate of 54 with a 1% low of 34 and a 0.1% low of 21. So you could take it down to medium or even low to get the highest FPS possible. Or what I always do, even on my RTX 3080 build, is I flick on performance and make everything low except for view distance just to get as many frames as possible. But no matter what you play on, Fortnite on the 1650 is going to run fantastic at 1080p. Sticking to the genre of battle royales, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds ran at 1080p with the high settings with an average frame rate of 64, a 1% low of 19, and a 0.1% low of 2. Again, there was one significant stutter that happened whenever I opened up menus in PUBG, which is where the 1% and 0.1% low come from. But fortunately, that only happened when I was switching into the inventory, so I would not expect that to be an issue for actual gameplay. The actual game ran very smooth. Before we get into the footage, I want to say that there is a flash warning up ahead in the top left corner of this because MSI Afterburner absolutely decided to just destroy itself while I was recording Doom Eternal and just began flashing, and I could not record any sort of benchmark, but I could see the number and it usually hovered around 70 FPS. You're going to have no issues playing Doom Eternal at 1080p with the low settings. And Fallout 4 at 1080p with the ultra settings ran with a frame rate of 56 FPS with a 1% low of 20 and a 0.1% low of 2. So unfortunately, there were pauses once more. I don't get what it is with some games and having loading screens that end up tanking frame rates, but generally speaking, the gameplay of Fallout 4 ran very smoothly. You're going to have no issues running it on this GPU. I wouldn't even recommend bringing it down to high. I think that ultra is fine, and you should just disregard the 0.1% low. And last but not least is an interesting case because my benchmark says that it ran at 150 FPS, but Resident Evil Village did not run at 150 FPS. Sometimes it would run at 90, and sometimes it would run at 30. Sometimes restarting the game would make it run at 90, and sometimes that 90 would just randomly turn to 30 and never recuperate, and sometimes even drop down to 24 FPS without any sort of changes to settings or location. It was very weird, and I don't know why Resident Evil had such a hard time with this GPU, but it happened to me last night. I have been using this GPU sort of just as something to play with, and Resident Evil Village is the game that I'm playing the most right now, and unfortunately, it did have a whole lot of frame issues. So just keep in mind that happens with the GTX 1650. And that was my exhaustive list with the GTX 1650. I recommend this graphics card wholeheartedly. 4 gigs of VRAM might be pushing it to the limits in a few years, so you might want to consider getting a 1066 gig if they're close enough in price. But I love this thing. If you're looking for something to slot into a Dell Optiplex, say goodbye to the 1050, say goodbye to the 750 Ti. This is what you should be slotting into an old Dell Optiplex to make it run great. I think that this is a fantastic GPU, and I'm going to keep it a little bit longer before I sell it off because I do just want to play with it for a little bit. That's the whole point of hardware, and that's why I do it, because I find it so much fun to use cards like this, and I hope you enjoy watching the videos that I make for you. If you like this video, like, subscribe, do what you usually do, and as always, buy, sell something nice. It's a low resolution, but to be quite frank, this game still looks good at 720p. We saw an average of 30 FPS with a 1% low of 16 and a 0.1% low of 6. Now that low 0.1% low was one freeze that happened at the beginning of the game. The rest of the game ran pretty smooth at around 30 FPS. So where some parts